In this video, we're going to talk about earnest money. So earnest money is a good faith deposit that you put down when you purchase real estate. Right? So when you purchase a home or a commercial building or something like that, you would put down earnest money as a deposit. Now it's important to note that earnest money is not a down payment. It's not the same thing. Now your earnest money might actually go toward part of your down payment, but it is not the same thing that we're talking about when we say earnest money. So the reason that we would have earnest money, and so we would want to show, for example, that the seller, that you're an actual sincere buyer. Right now you might think that that's obvious. You say, hey, look, if you show up and you make an offer on a home, they should just take it on faith that you're a sincere buyer. But what about somebody who went out and said, I'm going to make offers on this house and on this house and on this house and on this house. They're going to make offers on all those houses, and now they've taken all those houses off the market, right? And then they're just going to say, you know what, I'll just go ahead and decide later which one I like best. So when you're putting some money down as a deposit, right, you're putting some cash up front and saying, look, I'm sincere about buying this house from you, right? And the money doesn't have to be a substantial amount, but it could be anywhere from 1 to 5% of the intended purchase price, or it could be as low as something like $500. But you're just giving some money to show you got a little skin in the game, and that you're not just going around to properties and just making offers willy-nilly. Now, another thing that the earnest money is going to do is going to show that you have the financial means to complete the transaction, right? So even if you are a sincere buyer, and you say, yeah, you know what, I can come up with the down payment and I'll get financing and so forth. But if you don't have any actual money to go ahead and buy this house, then you're really wasting the buyer's time, and they're going to be taking their home off the market. So you're putting up some cash here, and you're saying, look, here's some cash. I have the financial means to complete this transaction. Now, in the event that the buyer breaches the transaction, in the event of some kind of default, right, you come up with a purchase agreement, right? So when the buyer makes the offer and the seller accepts, you write up a purchase agreement, and then this purchase agreement is going to have terms. Now, if the buyer breaches those terms, for example, if one of the terms is that if the buyer just decides they change their mind and they don't want to buy the house anymore, then it might, if it says in the purchase agreement that, okay, that's a breach of contract, then the seller might get that earnest money as compensation, right? So it's almost like punishing the buyer and saying, look, you didn't, you had me take this house off the market, and then you breached the agreement, you didn't pay for it, and now I need some compensation for, I've been harmed. I had this house off the market and I need to be made whole. Now, just because the agreement didn't go through, right? Just because you had a purchase agreement and then the house didn't close, you didn't actually have a completed sale, does not necessarily mean that the earnest money is going to go to the seller. And in fact, it's going to depend on what the purchase agreement says. So the purchase agreement might say that, okay, in the event that the buyer tries to complete the transaction but is unable to obtain financing for reasons outside the buyer's control, then the earnest money could be returned to the buyer. So it's not always that the earnest money is going to go to the seller if the transaction isn't completed, but it is there as a way of kind of punishing the buyer for bad behavior. So it might be useful to kind of think about a timeline of exactly how the earnest money fits into the home buying transaction. So first you're going to have, the seller accepts the offer. If that doesn't happen, obviously you're not going to have the home being sold. And so at that point, the buyer and the seller would sign the purchase agreement, and it's around that time that the buyer's going to give the earnest money, right? So the earnest money is not given directly to the seller. Matter of fact, that's something you really don't want to do, because if you give the earnest money to the seller and then there's some kind of problem and maybe the house doesn't pass inspection and you decide you don't want it, if you're the buyer, and you have legitimate cause to back out, you might have trouble getting that money back from the seller. You might have to sue them, right? So what you actually do is you give that earnest money to the broker, or you give it to a title insurance company. Basically, it depends on what state you're in, but you give it to a third party. That's what we'll just call it, a third party here. The real estate broker, the title insurance company, you give it to a third party, and they're going to hold it in what's called an escrow account. That's basically a bank account that is set aside specifically for holding things like earnest money. And so they're going to hold, that third party's going to hold the earnest money. And then at the end, when you go after you've had inspections and financing and so forth, the closing, when you sit down for the closing, that's when the earnest money would go either toward the down payment, as part of the down payment, or it could go toward closing costs, right? It's going to somehow be dispersed. And if there is no closing because there was some kind of problem in between, right? We had some kind of problem here where we don't have the closing and the transaction falls through, then the third party will make the decision. The third party will decide what happens to this earnest money. And that's why you're giving it to the third party instead of the seller. So you don't have a hard time figuring out what's going to happen. This third party has no interest, right? They don't financially benefit from this one way or another. So they can just hold the money and then disperse it. And how do they disperse it? They disperse it according to what was agreed upon in the purchase agreement.